he is just become the ward. He claims he's just become the ward of a 12-year-old girl that he's going to turn into his first Pygmalion girl, that he's going to mold her into a sex slave, who's now living with his wife, who will be later on his ex-wife.
All right, we are back with the illustrious Johnny Vedmore to explore another peculiar creature from the past. And I choose the word creature because this individual seems to have a load of history. All right, yeah, so we are speaking about the illustrious Horace Hod Dibben, and this guy seems to be associated with some really dark happenings all the way to Satanism, but also hanging out with gangsters like the Krays, possibly tangentially tied to JFK through his wife Mariela Novotny, and Martin Luther King, maybe. I don't know, but he is all over the map from RAF to Satan. Does that sum him?
If you were the best comedy character writer in history, there would be no one better than Horace Dibben to portray comedy through as a vehicle. And he was a very weird-looking, fantastically enigmatic character who kept everybody under his spell. He's a really interesting guy, and he is the beginning, the very beginning of a real load of really important things that would evolve and develop into intelligence operations galore. You know, really brilliant.
Okay, when you say that, and you say comedy, that's not the first thing that would come to my mind. But if I think about somebody else I've covered on another show that I do, Anton LaVey, is it a case sort of like that, where Anton LaVey, who is literally the leader of the Church of Satan, really didn't believe in Satan as far as we could tell? He was just a con man, potentially, or playing a character. So is Hod Dibben a character like Anton LaVey, or is he, in fact, an Aleister Crowley type?
He's everything to every person, because that's what he is. He's an influence hound, and he like LaVey and like others and like Crowley, he could see himself for what he is and what he looked like to other people outside. So he could see himself. He knew he could take control of his own character. So he's a bit of every single character around thrown into one, and he makes himself that.
So he's everybody but nobody.
Yeah, I don't know who Hod Dibben really is. If I could tell you, Hod Dibben in Douglas Thompson's book Scapegoat, is a moment where you could tell who Hod Dibben is by a lady who speaks about him. She used to run, I think she used to run the Black Sheep with him at one point. And she said he's sitting there in a party. He's in one of his free leather costumes that has a butt flap that unfolds down to expose his bum, and he explains that the leather's all right as long as he uses a bit of talcum powder. That is Horace Dibben. That is Horace. He's such a weird character. He's a strange. He's just everything that he does, but that's real him. Billy Hill, who I mentioned just then, who's a real big gangster in London, used to go to all Horace Dibben's sex parties. Well, Billy Hill described Horace Dibben as like very much like many of the RAF boys who come out of World War II. You know, they went up into the plane and they were up into the sky in their planes, and they were very unlikely to survive.
There also have been studies, I don't know if you've ever heard of them, called pilot studies. And different pilots have had these peculiar relationships where they shared a polygamous type of relationship with their wives.
Oh my God. I don't know if you've it's hard to, during this time, during the war, he's based in Orkney, Isles. He's based in a place called the village of Twat, Twatt. It's a real place. It actually exists. He is just become the ward. He claims he's just become the ward of a 12-year-old girl that he's going to turn into his first Pygmalion girl, that he's going to mold her into a sex slave, who's now living with his wife, who will be later on his ex-wife. He was, big into this term Pygmalion, which comes from, Dr. Dolittle, about making a lady. And the first Pygmalion girl was Patsy Morgan Dibben. She took his last name. He claims she came to him when she was 12, the daughter of it's a butcher or a baker. Then there's also the farmer's daughter, some people say. So it's unclear where she came from. But other newspapers say she was 16. So that would have been post-war. So trying to work that out. But still, it would be with his wife in the frame as well. And he was to make her, he claims in public, into a woman of society, an elite woman who could manage the elite men and would find. But in actual fact, she was the first sort of like sex doll that he created for the elite establishment sex parties. And he was starting it very early on.
What's a story about those four, or is it four or is it five stories about his quote satanic experience? Was it parody?
If you just look at Horace Dibben's claims about his relationship with Satanism, he was recruited by the Satanic Brotherhood in the Orkney Isles during the war. And he practiced as a Satanist for 2 years, and then he could never get out of it, and things kept happening. Bosameni was always coming back to him, like at the window he would see Bosameni's face and stuff, It was very over dramatic, over the top. It was very Horace Dibben. And by 1961, he's infamous around London town for not only having the best parties, because they run in the best parties. They were the sex parties of the elites. He was the inventor of the satanic man in the mask parties that Kubrick and others have mimicked. That was Horace Dibben who invented it, invented that sort of like feeling, the peacocks walking around the room and people like the Craze or Billy Hill sitting around watching Mariella Novotny perform oral sex on someone like a master, while lords and ladies like mingle around with each other. And like I say, you go to the toilet and Horace Dibben opens up the eye shutters and watches you as you go for a tinkle. We're talking about 4 articles that appeared either in the Sunday Mirror or the People, I think it was the People newspaper, over a month every Sunday. And it described Horace Dibben's relationship with the Satanic Brotherhood and with Satanism and his over-the-top experiences. But if you read one of the first ones, there's like this quick paragraph. His wife, Mariella Novotny, this young girl who's only 17, 18, has been smuggled out of JFK's bedchamber. And so she's just been smuggled out, and the heat is on Horace. Everybody's looking at him, and suddenly he comes out with these wild stories of Satanism, of being chased around by the Satanic Brotherhood, who were very like gimmicky, like, we'll get you in the end, Horace. Yeah, it's really over the top silliness. But it was to attract the rich people to his flavored parties, his amazing parties that would lead to the downfall of the British government. The parties in Hod Dibben's houses, these were all for intelligence purposes. These were because it was the center of where Soviet dead letter drops were being made in the darkened rooms of Esmeralda's barn. The rich elite were being recruited by the intelligence agencies and were feeling like they were special and hanging out in all of these special places, and the gangsters were suddenly welcomed in. A lot of these nightclubs would go from being all owned by females, all owned by gangsters, then all owned by intelligence. John Profumo, he was something like a war secretary or foreign secretary at the time, and he was having a relationship with a few girls, including who were hanging out in these sex parties, including Mariella Novotny. But he was having sex with these girls who were hanging out with this guy called Stephen Ward. Now, Stephen Ward is best friends with Horace Dibben. He's known as a society osteopath. He's the man who does all the massaging for the rich and famous, even when, the elites or intelligence people are all hanging around him all the time. Suddenly, at some point, he gets recruited into this sort of malaise.
I had 20, 30 members of the press at my door hanging about when I came in and out, and this went on for months and months. And then I did speak to the press because it had ruined my modelling career. So, and I wanted somebody to represent me.
Well, Christine Keeler was a sex pot who was basically with Profumo. Profumo was completely in love. But she had, of course, Russian links, and there was loads of Russian links around all of these people and Soviet links. So it meant that the very wonky government that was in power just fell apart, basically. So it wasn't like, the downfall of the British government, but there was a movie called Downfall made in about, I think it was 87 or something, where it goes through this whole affair. But at the center of this affair are all of these characters like Stephen Ward and Horace Dibben, etc. And Stephen Ward is like the Ghislaine Maxwell for the original Jeffrey Epstein. He would go find young girls who were prime for a guy called George Huntington Hartford II, and others. But he was also hanging around with all of these people like Christine Keeler, Mariella Novotny, and others Now, eventually, when the downfall happens and someone needs to pay, it is Stephen Ward who ends up in court, and when gets found guilty, supposedly takes an overdose and is dead and taken out, and then that's the end of the Profumo affair. That's like Stephen Ward was the scapegoat, as Douglas Thompson writes in his book Stephen Ward Scapegoat, how society loved him, but when he knew too much they killed him, or something along the lines. It's a very long title. Not only did they bring down the British government, but there was a very good chance that they could have brought down the American government if Mariella Novotny's presence in JFK's bedchamber had been, had been investigated more, and that would have maybe brought a light on JFK's sexual activity early on. But it looks like an intelligence operation.
How does it work anyway?
It usually works with models, and they go to bed with a particular man, and that's it.
How are the clients actually chosen? For their riches or for their political standing, perhaps?
Both.
Why?
Well, blackmail can be involved, of course.
After the Profumo affair, I don't know if I'm saying that right, what happened with Dibben? Is that when he started to sell off the club and move on to other adventures? What was next?
When the Profumo affair happened, that was the peak of Horace Dibben. Afterwards, there was a few more years of owning nightclubs, but then the nightclub scene, like I say, got taken over by intelligence, and all of the gangsters like the Krays suddenly got locked up. It was convenient to get rid of them and just lock them up really quickly, and then they owned all of the bars that they once had investment in, and they were in control of all of these areas. So I think the whole scene changed, and Horace Dibben admits later on that he worked for intelligence. Yeah, I think what happened was the gangster scene got really, really dangerous, and they went into hiding. And at one point, there's a load of papers who are trying to trace them down, and they find a woman called Henrietta Chapman Dibben living with Ronald Dibben, Chapman Dibben. And of course, he just can't get rid of his own name. And Henrietta Chapman was one of the alter egos of Mariella Novotny. much, and he liked to be out there too much, but he was getting old. By this point, he's like in his 60s, going on his 70s. So I'm pretty positive that his peak was behind him, and he had Mariella. It's like Mariella Novotny stayed with him right until the end. And then she writes a book. I think she writes a book which is like based on a fictional version of something which included elements of the things she was involved with in the late 70s. And then, she drowns in jelly in 1981 too. And Horace, he lives till old age. He has his grandson is into art these days. I think his name's Damien Dibben. Damien. I mean, you just can't make it up. Yeah. There's a lot more to that story, especially, I mean, Mariella Novotny's got her own story on the side too. The characters in there, they're really important. There's some really important people who will give you, the prototypes or doppelgangers in a sense for people who we know today. So, like I said, George Huntington Hartford, well, he's very much the original Jeffrey Epstein. Mariella Novotny, she's like this. There's not been many characters like her who come up again. She was a girl who, from the age of about 16, 17, realized that she could get men under a spell in a matter of moments, but you couldn't tell whether she was lying or not. But whatever, she could intoxicate everyone. And Horace Dibben was the man who captured that girl, in his 50s as this weird character. When we started this off, you said, it's a very strange for me how I sort of describe Horace Dibben, because in a sense he's like almost a hero. He's got this hero arc. He, all through his life, everything he does and he wants to do happens, it manifests. And he isn't really a Satanist. And this is what Satanism really, really, the first start of intelligence link within Satanism, I think, was it made the elites and the establishment, the people up at the higher echelons of the establishments, be able to have special parties and special groups that were just theirs, with people who they felt they could trust because they were all hiding this dark secret of being Satanists.
With built-in blackmail capability.
All of them are on the party boat and they all love it. And Horace Dibben is the captain of the party boat.
Wow, fascinating story. We'll definitely have to continue. I'm kind of wondering if we need to follow up with Mariella Novotny as her own story, because they seem to go well together. I find it fascinating that she stayed with him until she passed, which would seem unusual for such a manipulator, but perhaps they really were a team. It's an interesting
I would say one thing you've got to understand about that relationship is that I don't think they necessarily had sex for years at the end. They did here and there, but yeah, she was an opportunist. She was an amazing woman. I found a story about her mother and a guy who was a con man and a fraudster called Mr. Atherley, and it's an amazing story. And I think there was something in Mariella Novotny that was chasing like the ability to change herself and to take on loads of different disguises from a very young age. And that worked very well. But deep down, there's a love story there. Horace Dibben and Mariella Novotny found each other and they needed to find each other, and they both gave each other what they needed throughout a large part of their life, a really important part of their life. And I do think there is actually a love story there, and it was a very complicated sexual relationship because Horace Dibben wasn't necessarily into sex. He was into watching other people having sex. And she could twist every man around her finger. So she got to be with a man who funded her completely, her lifestyle, and just got to watch her do what she was best at, which was stand on a man and own him.
Wow. Interesting you use a hero's journey. The guy's not exactly a hero, but it is a definite interesting arc with some fascinating people. And I look forward to checking in on the next character out of this oddball history of your
Thanks
wonderful
for having
country.
me, man. Thanks for having me.